So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to everyone for this virtual roundtable on reshaping the future and rethinking education. I'd like to welcome you, first of all, on behalf of GPPAC, the Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict, which is a truly global partnership of civil society organizations stretching across the world, divided into 15 different regions. GPPAC was founded 15 years ago in New York with more than 1,000 civil society organizations and has kept up this active network that is truly connected and always trying to lead the way in peace building and in reshaping the future. I would like to thank the communications team very much for their initiative in this series of roundtables. I would also like to thank our distinguished participants, Charlotte Cole from Blue Butterfly, Tony Jenkins from Georgetown and Global Peace Education, Rachel Taza from Search for Common Ground, and Jen Batten, who, like me, is a member of GPPAC in the Peace Education working group. Today, we will be exploring some of the ways that we can make use of the current crisis that has caused so much uncertainty about the future. We will try to find a way to enjoy this uncertainty and welcome the future as a way to transform education away from the theme of being just another brick in the wall to a kind of education where there are no more bricks and no more walls, and where everyone can connect and think, everyone can be curious and compassionate and connected, where everyone can grow up able to listen and to be heard. In this particular year, 2020, for the United Nations, this is the year of listening and learning. For this particular day of the International Day of Peace, it is the day of compassion, kindness, and hope. These are also perhaps values that we want to work with our children. Across the globe, governments and school authorities struggle with the dilemma of whether or not schools should reopen. The pandemic has forced them to weigh the uncertainties of new spikes of the coronavirus versus the risk of children only receiving virtual education without the school environment and all the social and emotional learning that it brings. Or in many more cases, poor children not being able to be educated at all. It goes without saying that the pandemic has led to a true educational crisis and an alarming increase in educational inequalities. But the disproportionate impact of the virus on vulnerable populations, which after all is not an equalizer, is there a way that we can work through and across this inequality to create a more equal educational future? How can we turn this chaos into an opportunity to reconstruct educational systems across the world? How can we equip children with key skills necessary for this time and age, such as curiosity, interest in and respect for others, critical thinking, gender sensitivity, understanding and appreciation of science, and media literacy? What would these educational systems look like if we want to build a more peaceful world for tomorrow? What steps could or would we have to take to bring about these changes? In this virtual peace table, changemakers will discuss how we can build the world we want to see. They will dive into local to global challenges, initiatives, and methods for change to not only respond to crises, but to exploit them for good. This roundtable will help us see what a reimagined education system looks like if we put social cohesion, imagination, and critical thinking at its core. I would like now to start by allowing each of the participants to introduce, to introduce themselves. Could we start, please, with Charlotte Cole?
Thank you, Lucy. It's so nice to see you on the screen and to greet everyone, whatever time of day it is. My name is Charlotte Cole. I'm the co-executive director of Blue Butterfly. We're a nonprofit organization that provides technical support to media producers in low-income countries. We help producers develop high-quality children's media for education, health, and peace building. So thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Tony Jenkins.
Good morning or good afternoon or whatever time of the world it is for you. My name is Tony Jenkins. My day job is as a Peace Studies professor at Georgetown University. But my lifelong calling and the work that I do supporting peace education is through the International Institute on Peace Education, which is an international program that brings together educators from around the world to a different location every other year to explore theory and practice in peace education. And also I support advocacy through the Global Campaign for Peace Education, which is a global advocacy network that seeks to support the universalization of peace education into all formal and non-formal education and teacher training institutions.
Thank you very much, Tony. Rachel?
Hello, I'm Rachel Taza. I work with Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground is a conflict transformation organization that has been around nearly 4 decades now. And we're in 30 different countries, and we work on preventing violent conflict and addressing the root causes of conflict in places like Yemen, Nigeria, Lebanon, Sudan, Central African Republic, recently in Afghanistan. And then we also work in places like Sri Lanka, Morocco, and Sierra Leone on working on how decisions get made. And I'm in to build a more peaceful and just society. And I'm in the Children and Youth Division at Search for Common Ground. And we focus on how young people can be agents of conflict transformation in all of these different contexts where we work. And as part of that, we have been doing a lot of work to shape global policy and practice to recognize that young people are contributors to peace and security rather than just victims or perpetrators of violence. And so we were behind the introduction of UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security, which was the first to recognize the positive role that young people play in peace and security, and several UN Security Council resolutions after that.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Jen?
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you this morning. My name is Jen Batten, and I am the co-chair of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. One of the things that GPPAC's Peace Education Working Group has done for the last 14 years, our goal is really to work to help countries build capacity to do work on peace building and conflict resolution education at scale. And so that's everything from primary and secondary to higher ed to community work in 15 world regions. So that's the work that we do, and it's wonderful to be with you.
Thank you very much. What a fantastic set of participants in this conversation. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to read out the questions that I gave you all to think about, the general ones, and then I will come to each of you with a specific one. Looking into the future and bearing in mind the many challenges we are all facing or will have to face around the globe, in addition to the current pandemic, such as climate change, increasing global inequalities, what are the most serious problems you see with education systems at the moment, both in the region or regions where you work and globally? What would you change in education? What would you get rid of? What would you add? How would you build or create education systems for a more equal world, for a more peaceful world? What practical measures can be put in place now to get started? And who can get it started? Maybe everyone can start to reflect on these just for a minute or two. And I would like to start with a question to Charlotte, who is now at Blue Butterfly, which she founded, but she was also responsible for initiating many of the most innovative educational characters for Sesame Street, for breaking taboos, for really leading Sesame into the international educational role that it acquired. So Charlotte, from both your experience with Blue Butterfly and with Sesame Street, what are some of the most important ways we can work with media to enable education to create pathways to peace and build a more peaceful world?
Thank you, Lucy, for that question. I think, I'd like to address it from the perspective of children, because young children in particular have been my focus. And I think that the real strength of media in any kind of peace building effort, we need the tools to build peace. And media can be one of those tools. And I think as educators, when you're teaching anything, you always have to think about the incremental steps involved in learning something. So whether it's literacy, for example, you look at the fundamentals when you're teaching literacy. So in some languages, that's teaching the alphabet, it's teaching phonics, it's building a child's vocabulary, it's helping them understand comprehension. So those are all the building blocks of literacy. In peace building, we also have we are beginning to understand what the building blocks of peace building are. And at the core, for very young children, this is really centers on helping children understand their common humanity. So we can reach across divides when people understand the humanity that they share. And through that understanding of humanity, you can also build a respect for differences. I think where media holds a place in terms of that tool in the toolbox that we have, that is peace building, is that it can provide a window for children into the world of others. It can give children an opportunity to see themselves reflected as well as the lives of others. And it's from those experiences with both your own life and realities of things that are relevant to you, as well as looking into windows of children from other cultures, that we can build the bridges that help us to understand better our common humanity. And I think that's where media really can play a key role. Of course, it's not easy to do that, and promoting these kinds of messages on the media takes a lot of deliberate work, and both in what we were doing with Sesame Street. Lucy and I had the privilege to work together on a Sesame Street for Palestine, as well as in my own work now with Blue Butterfly, where we're developing programs all over the world with different producers. You can see this character, Zando, behind me, comes from a program in Haiti. It really requires a lot of deliberate, intentional approaches that must reside with the people from a given place that are represented on the screen. So we can use media as a way to present positive narratives about different cultures and help children understand really what they share. And again, it's really about our understanding our common humanity. Thanks.
Thank you so much. What an inspiring start. Thank you. I'd like to ask the your fellow participants, if they would like to react to that, if they feel that what resonates there, whether the incremental building blocks or the common humanity, or what would you like to respond, any of you? No? If you prefer, I can just go on and ask you each a question, and then we can come back. I hope we can get this to become a conversation, because I think what Charlotte said is absolutely fundamental to peace, the common humanity. That's what we need. But perhaps I sprung on you a little bit too quickly to respond. Let me move on in that case to Tony. Because Tony, you have extensive experience in peace education and peace building in many global institutions, including as coordinator for the Global Campaign for Peace Education, educational director for World Beyond War, as well as at Columbia University's Teachers College and at UNESCO. What are the most valuable lessons you would like to share from these experiences that could help lead the transformation to global citizenship and peace education? What are the connections you see between global citizenship and peace education? And how does education need to change to build a world beyond war?
Wow, I don't know if I can answer all those. I'm really thankful that you gave me those questions in advance. I've actually been thinking about them a lot since last week. As I think about maybe a thread that runs through all the various experiences that I've been engaged in over the last 20 or so years, I have to kind of put my hat on as advocate for peace education. So this response comes from that orientation. And in all those different contexts and settings, obviously one of the things that I've been looking to do is shape and influence education with the goals of the organizations that I was working with. So in the context of World Beyond War, it's, how do we educate for the abolition of war? In the case of my work at Teachers College, it was more broadly around general advocacy for peace education. But in any case, I guess the lesson I learned is in this advocacy role is as a political one. And I think there's an important lesson that we can take from peace education that can be applied to how we approach these kinds of tasks. And I think it's an obvious thing here from a philosophical point of view that I think we all understand that all education is political in some sense or shape, right? That all, at least at the formal level, all education has very clear social and political purposes. Well, let me walk that back. They're not always clear. Sometimes they are explicit, those purposes. Sometimes they're a bit more implicit. Oftentimes they're very hidden. But ultimately, those are the purposes that the learning intends to contribute to a society, all right? The preparation for participating in political processes or in economic systems or in social life. I think, all right, let me go back to my point of view about being an advocate. As I approach this kind of work, trying to get education systems, institutions, schools, and teachers, others to consider integrating these values, these perspectives, these approaches to peace education, there's a tendency for all of us as we engage in that very political work to move into those traditional political modes of winners and losers, of me just trying to get in a real kind of black and white world, me trying to get my point across and get you to adopt my point of view. And clearly, we know from an educational point of view that doesn't work. Right? So I think one of the big lessons I've learned over the years, and this is a concept that I've adopted from my mentor, Betty Reardon, so we need to learn to engage in politics in a learning mode, in the same way in which we would step into a classroom. If coming from a point of view of peace education, we tend to shift our teaching orientation from one that is instrumental in nature, which isn't necessarily bad. You know, A plus B equals C. It helps us, you know, give us some kind of guidance for how we navigate the world. But we generally try to make that shift from that sort of instrumental orientation of instruction to a more meaning-making orientation of instruction, right? So the learning becomes relevant and significant to the persons in which we're engaging. And so for me, what I found has been most successful in playing this advocate role is adopting that approach of approaching politics as a learner, of asking questions to those who I'm engaging with to help them make meaning of the value of the work that I bring. If that makes sense. And maybe I'll give one short story that I think illustrates this. And this is where I learned this idea most concretely. So years ago, I was working with some colleagues in Colombia, a wonderful educator named Amada Benavides, who works with the School for Peace Foundation. We had an opportunity to talk with Ministry of Education officials about an opportunity to further integrate peace education into a particular policy platform. And we could go to that meeting and of course just advocate why we think it's important. But what my colleagues did was just so beautiful and profound. So we showed up at this conference room and they laid mandalas out on the table with pencils and crayons. So we had ministry officials and members of their team sitting side by side and just engaging in thoughtful conversation as they were focusing on illustrating these beautiful mandalas together. And we're not even talking about the topic, our political goals yet. And shortly later, we're engaging them in activities that they would use with youth. We did a blind trust walk with members of the Ministry of Education. It was just really a wonderful, profound thing to get them to experience that, to understand, and not just understand it, cognitively, but to feel it, in a sense. And to me, so again, I found that that's been probably the most significant lesson I've taken from all these various hats I've worn over the years.
Thank you very much. Lovely, lovely story too. Thank you very much indeed. So learning, basically coming with a learning approach. Thank you. Rachel, in your work, empowering children and youth to be true agents of conflict transformation in their countries, what have you found most effective and why? And to what extent can this work be replicated or even incorporated into formal education systems around the world?
Thank you, Lucy. While I was thinking about this, I was thinking also some of those other questions that you had shared. What are some of the main challenges or problems and how can we respond to those? I think one of the main challenges we see is that education is still seen as young people being the beneficiaries and adults as the providers. And so if we want to flip that script and really engage young people and support their ownership of education as something that is going to shape the rest of their lives, should help them respond to the challenges that they face for the rest of their lives, I think one of the first things we can do is look to young people and see what they're saying. And so I mentioned earlier this UN Security Council Resolution 2250, which was the first to recognize the positive role of young people in peace and security. And that resolution mandated a progress study, which was conducted in 2018 and was this really great field-defining study asking young people, what are your main concerns around peace and security? What are the ways that we can solve some of those concerns? And it was very participatory, consultative, engaged, I think something like 4,000 young people around the world. And what was really striking is the consistency with which young people came back and said, the biggest challenge I face is the violence of exclusion. And what did they mean by this? They meant that structural and the psychological violence that they face, being marginalized, excluded, kept out of the decisions that affect their day-to-day life. They experience that as a violence, as this structural or psychological violence. And thinking about how we can reverse that, counteract that, and turn the tables on this violence of exclusion. And so this is something that we try to do a lot with the work that Search for Common Ground does, peace education, and sometimes we say education for peace, and it's more totality. And so there are three main, I tried to distill it down to three main lessons or ideas that I think we could take away from it, and I'd love to discuss more. So one of the most important lessons in our work is in shorthand, we say, replace the power of the gun. What do we mean by that? Weapons and guns immediately flip that power dynamic, where young people are so used to being marginalized, not heard, and suddenly with a weapon in hand, they're being taken seriously. And so in our programs, we try to look, what are the alternative ways that we can really help young people's voices be heard, be taken seriously, to replace kind of that power dynamic shift that otherwise weapons can offer very immediately. And so some ways that we do this are through youth-led media. We're currently running adolescent-led media programs, radio programs in Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Mali. For example, so in Macedonia, we're working on a program where we're working with teachers and the Ministry of Education at a number of levels on supporting interethnic, multicultural, bilingual education that brings young people, that brings children together. Well, to complement that, we're also running media programs, taking a very participatory approach with young people that also highlight all of the progress being made so that we can work a bit on the system around many of these issues to perpetuate more social norms that support inclusion. So it's not just equipping young people with the skills, we also have to recognize that the system around them sometimes doesn't even let them apply those skills. So that would be maybe the first thought I'd bring. And then the second would be, how can we work to transform relationships? Transforming relationships is another really critical part of our work to actually give young people the space to be agents of conflict transformation. And what do I mean by that? I mean that many times empowered youth are viewed as threats to adults. And if we don't engage adults in the process, then we may actually be doing more harm than good. And so in Tunisia, we partnered with Big Bad Boo and the Ministry of Education, and they developed this really incredible multi-dimensional media program called 1001 Nights. And a really important part of that program was engagement with parents and interactive discussion and how they can engage their children, and focusing on transforming some of those relationships between students and their parents. Another example I'll give is in northeastern Nigeria, where we're working on a program with UNICEF for the reintegration of children formerly associated with armed groups. We have components for accelerated education to help them reintegrate. We have components for employment skills, but one of the most effective and important parts of that program are transformational dialogues between young people and the communities they're returning to, between the young people who were formerly associated with armed groups and the parents that they're going back to, because there are so many hidden questions there, uncertainties, and until those relationships are transformed, you could have a great education program, but something like 80% of these young people's lives are outside of the classroom, and that's what will really sustain. The third point I would bring up is don't just teach inclusivity, be inclusive. And this is a lesson that we really try to program into our program. So that means designing our project teams as well as participants across conflict divides, ensuring that we're not perpetuating segregation or parallel realities. And one program that I think did this really, really well in Kyrgyzstan is called Josh Stan. We worked with UN Peacebuilding Fund on this. And it had, again, multiple components, but what we did really intentionally here was figure out how to engage the disengaged or hard to reach young people. So these were children of parents who had participated in violent extremist groups and returned, or parents who were incarcerated, or whose parents were migrant workers and weren't there. And so these children were being raised by their grandparents. And that took a considerable level of effort that goes many steps beyond simply saying, here's our program, attend if you want to really developing those relationships with social workers, with changing the language with how we were promoting this program. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much indeed. Very, very interesting, especially what you said about, I thought we tend to forget how empowered children or empowered youth can be seen as a threat. It's easy to think that the more one empowers other people and gives people voice, the better, but you have to prepare people for this. It's quite true. And the structural violence, the violence of exclusion, I think this is something perhaps that we will come back to. But first, let me just ask a question for Jen. Jen, you have more than 20 years of experience in a very wide range of sectors: government, education, NGOs, along with a huge, again, range of schools and institutions, including UNESCO. You've taken peace education and conflict resolution education to scale all over the world, from Switzerland to Afghanistan, from Colombia to Northern Ireland and Qatar. You've also pioneered online teaching and accessibility for universities and schools. What would you like to share with those who want to take their versions of peace education to scale? What are some of the major challenges you faced, and how can you and others overcome these? I'll get later to ask what your vision is. Maybe you deal with those two to start with.
So thank you so much, Lucy. It's been wonderful to hear some of the comments and reconnect actually with Charlotte when you were at Sesame Street. Amazing work that you're doing around the world. Rachel with Search for Common Ground, who has an incredible track record, and we love working with Saji, one of your colleagues, on and the great work we're doing with the youth peace and security work, and Tony Jenkins, of course, from the Global Campaign for Peace Education. What I'd love to do is, so thinking about taking things to scale, I think if we're going to focus on that with COVID-19, I'm going to speak to it from that perspective, because that has really changed our world and how we as educators then focus on building capacity. So I'd like to think a little bit about, you know, we have policies around the world in most of the countries that relate to either peace education or conflict resolution or related topics. That might be human rights, we might call it, or social emotional learning. And I think there are a couple key things. One, bringing together the key stakeholders early on is a key that we doesn't always happen. Sometimes they're brought in later, and so that's really important. Another piece is that how we prepare our teachers. So a lot of the organizations all over the world, governments and NGOs, tend to prepare their teachers with what's called a cascade approach. So that's where maybe one person is trained, and then the hope is that that person will keep training others. But we know through the good practice research that doesn't work. What we really need to do is prepare master trainers to then help provide ongoing support for teachers for there to be that long-lasting impact as we build capacity. And with those policies that we have, it doesn't matter if we're in the United States or if we're in Kenya or where we are in the world, we're going to be able to find that there are not the checks and balances for those policies that we would really like to see, so that it happens on the ground or it hasn't been funded well. So I think with this new reality with COVID-19, one of the things that we want to think about is particularly how all of our education work has been taken to technology so quick. And one of the challenges with that is no matter how great of a teacher we are, it takes some time to learn how to use those different kinds of technology to teach well and to transfer our peace education work to technology. What I'd like to do just for just 30 seconds is take us to maybe a minute to a couple of websites so that you could see, if I could share my screen real quick, if the host can enable me to do that, just show you a couple of websites, and I'll stick the links then into the chat box so that folks will be able to find those later. Let me see if I can go ahead and share. So one of those I think that I'd really like to have folks think about is with participatory video. So participatory video is something that I know Lucy's done in in her part of the world in the Middle East, and then also in Kyrgyzstan, they have used participatory video. So that's a great tool now that we've moved to peace building in the time of COVID to use to engage young people like Rachel was talking about. And so I'd encourage folks to come back and take a look at that. I think one of the other things we really want to think about that is so critical as teachers in peace building right now is digital literacy. And so one of the things that this organization called Teaching Tolerance, and I actually haven't seen this in other parts of the world, so that's why I'm focusing on this here in the US, is they've taken and they've created actual curriculum standards for digital literacy. So if you're in primary and secondary grades, and also lessons, that's really, I think, important as we've moved to a lot of use of technology. And then I would just think about most countries, or many countries in the world, have actually some form of policy around bullying, and really thinking about, but what happens a lot, and I can talk about this from having worked on the law here in our state of Ohio in the US, is there aren't those checks and balances. So we ask schools to do this work, but then we don't check and help provide that ongoing support. This one talks about cyberbullying actually in the Philippines and the law there. So I'll put some of these links in, but I think for peace building during the times of COVID-19, we really want to think about how do we move it using technology as teachers, and how do we do that well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to give an open question to the participants. We've had really informative thoughts about the problems and about how you're addressing them. How would you like to see education looking? What would you do? What would you hope to see in an education system 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road? Obviously, we can't know if we're going to be hit with pandemics or climate change, but assuming you had a bit more control than we have, what would education actually look like? How would you bring out that common humanity? How would you stop the structural violence? How would you bring that political, social element so that it's something positive, not something negative? How would you make sure that everyone is digitally literate and able to make the most of themselves in relation to the world, in relation to others, in relation to technology? What would you like to see? It's hard to imagine, I think, but whoever would like to have a first stab at it, picking up on the very important themes you've all brought up.
I could respond maybe briefly.
Great.
I think when we're thinking about how do we address this violence of exclusion that young people are facing, I would see an education system where young people, those who are actually, the target population of education, are involved in reviewing curricula and, doing policy reform and assessing whether or not education and our education systems are meeting their needs. So I would say a more inclusive approach where young people are actually part of decision making, including defining what success looks like and whether we're meeting it.
Thank you very much. Jen, with all your experience around schools and education systems, would you think what's your reaction to that?
So I absolutely, what Rachel was talking about is really important to be able to do that. And I think because I spoke so much, I should probably let it go over to Charlotte or Tony, and then I'm happy to respond. Thank you.
Okay, Charlotte.
Okay. Well, I think one of the critical words here is inclusion, and how that's defined in its many different facets. And related to that, or a piece of inclusion, is access. And if we, as we kind of move into a world where technology is used increasingly in education, then access issues and inclusion take on a whole different turn. And so into the future, whereas before we were focused on brick and mortar schools, which we still need to be focused on, we also need to be focused on how do we make sure that all children have access to the technology that is going to be increasingly crucial for the educational elements. So I think really the heart of all of this is inclusion, and kind of how you define that in almost any realm of it. So that's what.
Thank you. Would you see ways of working with technology to promote that inclusion?
I think there's a number of ways that technology can promote inclusion, but it also can contribute to exclusion if people don't have access to it. But I think that one of the things we're seeing, certainly in a COVID world, is the importance of teachers, and their role may be changing, but is increasingly crucial. And so how do we train teachers so that they're promoting and using the technologies that are available? So again, that sort of comes down to how are you including teachers in the process of that learning? How do you include youth, as Rachel was talking about? And I think that we need to be more strategic about it now. And we have some opportunities now, just by what happened kind of during emergency situations with COVID, that have prompted us to really reconsider what education is and what it can be. But now is an opportunity for us to really be thinking about how to recast that and how to make sure that we're not increasing the gap, that we're helping to close the gap between those that do and don't have access.
Can I respond to I wanted to.
Yes, of course. Great.
I love this concept that Rachel introduced, this idea of the violence of exclusion. I think it's really important one for us to explore here even a little bit more deeply. To me, as I think about Security Council Resolution 2250 and then the precedent that came before it, like 1325 on women, peace, and security. I mean, yes, they highlight, of course, the positive role, but they also point out that effective peace building practices require the inclusion of these voices, the disproportionate impacts and the experiences and approaches and views of peace building that are brought by women, youth, etc. And as I think about this violence of exclusion, and we can bring that down to the level of the classroom, as Rachel was just exploring, even for teachers, empowered youth in the classroom are a threat to their authority. And so there's obviously a tremendous challenge we need to address in teacher training, and looking at the hierarchy of knowledge that exists in learning, preparing teachers to feel comfortable in a space where they're allowing students to be co-creators of knowledge, I think is really, really important. I mean, so Jen was talking too about the significant importance of teacher training, and I think that is such an overlooked part of the challenge for bringing these things to scale. What that really looks like. I mean, one of the things that I always talk about in the teacher training that I do, it probably, it's how we teach is probably more important than what we teach, quite honestly. It's through the modeling of those relationships that we can, reproduce those hierarchies, knowledge disparities, in which we can devalue students' contributions to the learning, and we create in those spaces. Obviously, as I was bringing up in my first comments, opportunities for meaning making, which is to me what the fundamental goals of what all education should be oriented to. So not just about knowledge and skill acquisition, but developing and connecting that learning to the students' experience of the world, so that they're going to act upon it and do something with it, all right, meaningfully in the world, rather than just have it as some sort of trivial knowledge that they possess. So that to me is a really exciting framing. Thank you, Rachel, for bringing up this idea of the violence of exclusion.
Thanks. Lucy, this is Jen.
Yes, please.
Great. So I think, one of the things is that when we've prepared our teachers before, we weren't preparing them. We were preparing them for a traditional classroom, as most of us have talked about. And I actually think this can be exciting, because one potential good thing that comes out of this is that if we take this time now to prepare our teachers to use technology more, we can encourage more of bringing the world to our classrooms, which will help bridge some of the social cohesion challenges. So partnering classrooms with other classrooms around the world, which some teachers had already done, but teaching our teachers how to use podcasts. And the other thing is, young people have been using technology far more than many of us as adults. They know how to turn on TVs with 3 remotes, when some of us don't even know, like, where's the on button, right? So one of the great things is having young people be able to teach us as adults how to use it. They're already excited about technology, so they're gonna want to use things like participatory video to make changes in their community. They're gonna want to be doing podcasts or some of these kinds of things. So it's a great way to then do also video conferencing with other classrooms. I know that one of the things that our city is going to be doing because of COVID is, which we might not have thought about before, was to read between 2 different communities that have very different demographics, cultural backgrounds, and some of our immigrant classrooms with young people who are older, who have a different language ability, but we're reading books around creating welcoming classrooms, basically, and how you engage young people from different cultural backgrounds. And so that's pretty exciting, bringing many of our classrooms with refugees together with non-refugee classrooms, so the young people can get to know each other in 3rd grade, ages at 6 and older. So I think there are some ways that we can use this horrible situation to really improve our classrooms and bring more cultural diversity into them.
Jen, I really agree with what you're saying. And I also think, though, that there's a responsibility for governments and for the international development community to be investing in the infrastructure that's needed, the technological infrastructure, so that communities that don't now have access will have access. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, both in terms of kind of the training that you're talking about, and developing the programmatic elements, but there's also an investment in the technologies itself that needs to happen to make sure that we're ensuring access and not then contributing more to an exclusion.
Absolutely. And even before COVID-19, although I'm here in the United States, many of our college students were still accessing their courses if they were online from their phones, or going to McDonald's to be able to access. So there are challenges in many of our countries with access to being able to access to education, period, now, and the disparity based on socioeconomics is absolutely exacerbated. So even here in Ohio, some of our schools in mountains regions have not had school since March because there is no access to the internet. And so we need to also learn here in some of our countries how to use what other countries have been forced to use, like our phones for education or television during this time. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Rachel, did you want to respond a bit to what you started with?
Sure. I was just going to say a little bit on the challenges that technology brings with inclusion, especially for groups who might have such difficulty accessing internet and things like that. I think while it's great that we embrace technology, especially as young people are often leaders in that space and how it's used, recognizing that it can also replicate so much of that exclusion, so much of that, you know, when we talk about cyberbullying and who has access to that technology. I think we shouldn't be shy to explore other more creative or more traditional approaches for reaching people who might not have that access, like radio. Radio has been an incredibly powerful tool in many of the places where we work for reaching people who might not have access to internet or on their phones, or, you know, maybe now an internet cafe is not as accessible because of restrictions on meeting. So yeah, and I would just say, I would go back to the idea that developing these strategies and tactics and approaches will be most effective when we do it with young people and their parents and their communities, inclusively, participatorily.
And I really love where this conversation is going, and I agree with everything that's been put out here in terms of examining some of the challenges of exclusion and inclusion with online learning spaces, the need to develop infrastructure and those challenges. And I think there is another layer that we also need to be thinking about, one which we haven't done significant enough research. Is always is the case with technology, the social ramifications are almost always considered last, right? So pedagogically, we need to begin doing some more effective research on different ways in which people learn in these spaces. It's a very different space for learning than in an in-person classroom. How we think, how we connect. So I mean, right now, I have mixed emotions about the technology. I mean, I'm hoping right now, of course, that it's just a stopgap, and I think it's been really good in this point of COVID to be able to maintain continuity of learning. But we haven't pedagogically leveraged these platforms effectively. How do you create these spaces for authentic listening, and which is so important to peace education? You know, how do you assure for spaces of dialogue and engagement and interaction, and spaces where students can learn and really important and develop important capacities of cooperation and you know, co-learning with peers. So I'm not saying those things can't be done, but I don't think we've done enough careful investigation into how we best do that, and the ways in which some of the technology is actually can impact and create more harm than good in some ways. So.
Thank you all very much. That's one way of how we teach, using the technology, but I think there's the other side of the inclusivity, even in classrooms, even in the bricks and mortar still, that stays important. And I don't know if any of you would like to comment on how that can be, what your vision would be of really how or what you would teach. Yes, led by youth, as Rachel points out, perhaps, but in a non-threatening way, in consultation, lots of key stakeholders there. Are there things you would like to add to this if we're trying to build incrementally our way to real education that will build peace? What would be some of these incremental steps that Charlotte mentioned at the beginning, that you have to have the tools, you have to build things little by little? How could we start actually building towards a real education for peace? And not just for peace, but with the full understanding of, I think, Tony, you refer somewhere to critical peace education. I think that's a nice term. Maybe you'd like to explain it, and then we can take off from there.
Sure, I could try to explain that. Critical peace education, refers to an approach that grows out of the tradition of the work of Brazilian popular educator Paulo Freire. And so, one very important aspect of the work that we do in peace education, which can be really threatening to systems and formal education students in politics, is we invite students into reflection that involves a critique of reality, examining power structures and imbalances and injustices that exist, developing a kind of a critical consciousness and awareness of those ideas. The popular concept of now being woke, I think embodies what the kind of goals of critical peace education are. But if we put this into sort of like an incremental framework, the way, not that learning is ever sequential necessarily, but one of the ways that I kind of structure the learning in my courses and the teaching that I do is it involves a series of incremental kinds of inquiries that move us towards a more peaceful direction. So one is starting with that space of critical reflection on reality. What is, in terms of the present reality that I'm in. So developing that consciousness. And then kind of the next layer of inquiry that kind of comes and follows that is then a broader sort of kind of inquiry of ethical reflection. So what should be? What are the values that would inform the world that I would like to be in, that I'm not seeing in the world as it is? And then the third stage, and this is the part that I think is missing more than anything else, is the sort of the speculative and the contemplative reflection about what could be. So I think that there's a huge missing piece in a lot of our design work that excludes this futures orientation that's so important to peace education, because peace education is a really active approach to learning. It's about shaping the future that we desire. Right, so here is a space where we can develop really intentionally in our curriculum opportunities for students to engage in modeling of alternatives, to envision preferred futures that they desire that would be based upon the values that they're learning to articulate and describe. To engage in design, testing, exploring these alternatives together in community. And I think that, to me, could be a really helpful beginning point.
Thank you very much. Who would like to pick that up?
I will.
Charlotte, thank you.
Thank you for that. I think another piece that relates to this is when we're looking at kind of the pedagogic elements of it, what kinds of content we provide for our children. So, and again, going back to this critical word of inclusion, this kind of falls into place in kind of every aspect of education. So when we're teaching children to read, are the stories that we're presenting to them reflective of their own reality? Are they showing diverse and inclusive environments? Are they representing a child's life so that the child can relate? And are they also opening up the world to the child, to others and the way others live? And so much of the content that we expose children to in the education sector is dominated by just sort of a kind of myopic vision. And part of what we need to do into the future, if we really want to be promoting inclusivity and we want to be promoting some of these very core peace building messages, is to make sure that the content, whether it's a math book, you know, or some kind of story that the children are learning, or science, that it is embracing this concept of diversity and inclusion in what we're exposing children to.
Thank you very much. And yeah, you mentioned at the beginning also how with media, it also encourages self-reflection, that this is one of the things that doesn't necessarily get addressed so much, but it does help with the centering in the reality, and then from that perhaps to move on to the ability to model alternatives, even for adults, even for those of us that no longer officially learn. Apparently just reading novels, reading anything, really has a significant impact on the brain and on one's acceptance of diversity and things. It doesn't even have to be specifically focused content, but it is obviously absolutely crucial. Rachel, did you want to come in on this at all?
Sure. I think that these are really insightful, helpful ways to think about how to approach this practically. I know when I think about change, and when we're speaking with young people, we really try to focus on where is that change really going to happen. And so very much in line with what the others have said, I think giving space first for that self-transformation, and with many of the principles and content and learning materials that the others have talked about, and not just for the students, also for teachers and parents. And then giving space for transformation in those relationships, and recognizing that education or school is often the first meeting place for young people and the state. And, you know, offering some models perhaps of student government, of peace clubs, where young people are able to mitigate issues that arise between teachers and students, which may be, you know, second nature in some places, but just isn't part of the concept in schooling in other places. And so I think giving practical experiential models or spaces where young people can actually navigate those really difficult relationships that isn't necessarily only in a classroom is really important.
Thank you. A vital part of education too, not just the classroom. Jen?
Yep, so I'm excited by what we're talking about here, because, you know, we really want to think about how do we, with peace education, frequently early on, it was left to being knowledge, and we weren't really teaching the skills that go with it. And the clubs, it could be through podcasts, it could be through virtual connections to other classrooms, it could be to participatory video. So I really appreciate the idea of having the opportunity and giving young people the ability to take the knowledge and the skills and to apply those in their communities to make change. And so sometimes that's also the service learning component, and where they have projects in the community where they're able to do some things. But one of the great things is, as Rachel was mentioning, to really have young people engage and have them be part of the learning process. They can come up with some amazing projects and using technology to make change in their communities for the better. And so engaging them in those creative ways is perfect for peace education.
Thank you. Maybe that's a good time to open up the floor to questions. Do we have any questions, Martin, from participants or not yet?
Hi, Lucy.
Hi,
Actually,
Emma.
I've been keeping track of the chat, and we've had some very interesting discussions there. Many interesting reflections. Some people are recognizing both the positive consequences of the COVID pandemic and the potential of this new online developments with technology, for example, as a tool for blended learning approach, but also definitely acknowledging the challenges that go beyond the curricula, for example, causing mental challenges for students and teachers, and negative consequences such as digital exclusion. So one question that I have here is from Celestial Bernas. And the question is, I understand that every one of us has to go through to this kind of system, taking online classes, but when it comes to the learner's experience, especially in marginalized communities, I'm reading concerns such as they are not learning anymore, they are just taking online classes for submission only. How does the system can enhance this kind of experience of learners? And I think we have touched up, participants have touched upon this question a bit already, but if you have any more reflections on this question, so how can it also enhance a positive experience for learners despite the challenges?
Yeah, I think we have touched on that to some extent. Would Charlotte, perhaps you'd like to add a little bit about some examples from Haiti or from your other work?
Well, I do think that there, you know, the opportunities now as that sort of have come forth is they've sort of uncovered different learning styles, and I think this was kind of talked about before in terms of the pedagogy, but I think, you know, it's one thing that has been interesting with COVID is that there have actually been some learners that have benefited from the remote learning opportunities where they're actually some kids are actually performing at a higher level when they're in the remote situation than they were when they were in school, and vice versa. There's been sort of some reversals in some education systems where some of the kids who were performing at the higher level are sort of falling behind because they don't have the structure. And I think what both of those kinds of incidents tell us is that we need very much to be thinking about how people learn, which I think is something that was mentioned before, and how they learn from different technologies, and then how we can meet the needs of different learners in different ways. And so I think we have a huge opportunity now in the education sector to really be thinking about how we can educate differently and how we can educate all. But we need to be very strategic. We need to be kind of using what we're learning now and iterating and developing sort of second order change in the education sector. And it's going to be tricky because we have to really be thinking as we're also trying to adjust. So I don't know if that really answered the question very well, but I do think that some of what's come forth recently is that we have some opportunities to think about how people learn, how they learn well, and what kinds of technologies we can apply to really increase that learning. And certainly, you know, media is one way of promoting that inclusion and of kind of bringing a diversity of experiences, but it's only as good as the content that's developed for it and the infrastructure that we provide for using it. So we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Anyone else on that? Thank you very much. And you raised actually, how can we educate all and how can we educate differently? These are fundamental to taking advantage of the opportunity. Thank you. Were there any other questions? I see this, someone called Ben.
I have a question here from Kanyua Nonduto.
Okay.
The question is, since the main challenge is digital exclusivity, how best can digital learning be leveraged to achieve inclusivity?
I'd like to take that. Jen? Tony? Rachel?
One thing we can consider is kind of, and this was mentioned before, you know, some of the other kind of lower level technologies like radio, audio formats that are more accessible. And that, you know, I think that there's a lot that's being explored on that front, and how can we use technologies that people already have better. So delivering, you know, we're, for example, doing a project in Haiti where we're delivering daily audio learning messages via WhatsApp to parents of young children. And, you know, it's certainly far, it's got a lot of flaws to it, but it is bringing learning experiences to people using technologies that many people have. Radio is another way. There's also, you know, call-ins through phones and other kinds of solutions that are being explored, so that we can increase the access even in places that where there isn't electricity, in, you know, that's accessible. So I think part of the challenges of this is for us to be thinking about not only how do we build the infrastructures to be more inclusive, but then how do we take what we already have and what people have access to and build learning environments that enable children to learn. It's a big task.
Thank you. That's really important. Just using things like the mobile phones that people have in so many places where they don't necessarily have more sophisticated computers and so on, but using what we have. Thank you.
And
Rachel,
just briefly sure. I was just going to build briefly on what Charlotte said. Completely agree. Meeting people where they are, WhatsApp groups, you know, we have used those really effectively before. And I think also remembering that online spaces need moderation, need skilled facilitators, and preparing teachers or other students in the classroom to facilitate some of those online spaces where we know, you know, there's well documented evidence that it is easier to slip into aggression and distancing and dehumanization online when there is this additional degree of separation. And so our partner organization, SOLIA and Search, have been working on a lot of virtual exchange programs. And we know that the most critical element to these virtual exchange programs and dialogues and, you know, virtual interactions between people from very different backgrounds with very different viewpoints is the role of a facilitator to help create that safe space.
That's interesting because we heard earlier about the importance of the role of teachers, but yeah, facilitators too, people to at least make sure that that inclusion really happens and is done the right way. It goes back again to how people teach and how they interact. Tony, were you going to?
Yeah, I'm just going to add to what I think has already been brilliantly stated here. I mean, I think there's two layers of inclusion for us to explore here. One inclusion is more as equal access to learning, and so some of these other forms of technology that are not, you know, so bandwidth dependent, like Zoom and other online spaces, using your phones, radio, other technology. Those are pretty accessible for a lot of people. But those, I mean, maybe I need to do some more thinking about this, but I feel that they're obviously limited in terms of their ability to engage people. Like those are pretty good formats for, you know, lecturing and disseminating ideas and knowledge, but providing that space that creating that environment where we can engage with others and dialogue and discussion around that it's a much more complicated challenge, I think, that we're facing right now. So creating an inclusive platforms that all can access that bring in these pedagogical dimensions that are so important to peace education is the challenge that I think we're confronting right now. I do some good things and some bad things. My tendency, like immediately as we were thrust to move from in-person to online, was I'm going to make my online classroom the same as my in-person classroom. It's going to be synchronous, going to make sure all the students are there. But that ignored the fact that there was a certain percentage of my students who were dealing with very complicated realities at home. They're all of a sudden they're caretakers of their siblings, or they're having to take a job, or they have low access, they have one computer in their home that they're sharing with their parents who have to work from home. And so, my effort to create the same space on Zoom excluded a certain group of people, those people who are already the most vulnerable to begin with. So there's multiple layers to this challenge that it's going to take us some time to sort out.
Thank you for sharing. Jen, did you want to also come in on this? I see you mentioned in the chat a little bit.
So yeah, so what I've been doing is putting into the chat some of the links. So if people are interested, some of the links to Celia that Rachel mentioned, which is a great organization that's been using technology for quite a while to bridge classrooms and groups from different countries together. And some other links for people if they want to read more about some of the content that we've talked about here. So one of the things that I did see in the chat was about parent engagement. And so how parent involvement leads to student success in today's online and distance learning. So that is, oh my goodness, that is overwhelming parents around the world as they are asked to both, many of them have full-time jobs, and to now be teachers of their young people using technology that they may or may not know how to use as well. So I think that would be a great question for us to think about. One of the ways that one nice thing about the technology, and maybe Charlotte or Rachel or Tony could talk a little bit more about the parent engagement too, but we're connecting our classrooms from different school districts around literacy and giving students books to take home around aspects of diversity and inclusion, and then having them read with their parents, having times to then come online with the author of those books to then have like a story time with parents and their children. So there's some opportunities there as well. But maybe Charlotte, Rachel, and Tony could also share some of the ways. I know that Tony at least is one of those parents who's needing to do online teaching while also doing his full-time job of teaching. So I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Jen. I like this idea of the story time. Maybe parents welcome it too if they get a little bit of a reprieve. Tony, did you want to add to that, or?
Oh, I've been traumatized by this experience. I mean, of course, I have a daughter who's pre-K aged, and so the experience of online learning is just not very effective for her. So she can't sit still for an hour and look at a screen. It doesn't reflect her reality of the world, and so of course that means I have to sit with her for that hour or whatever it might be. I don't know, beyond the points that Jen brings up, I don't know if I have anything else to add. I think particularly for students who are younger, this is a big problem. Yeah, everyone is completely overwhelmed, and it's not just supporting the online learning, but it's now it's mentoring and making sure your child is doing their homework, is actually showing up online. The experience I hear from most K-12 teachers I know in the United States is that their Zoom classes are maybe 2 or 3 videos on. Most everyone's screen is blank. It's hard to even know if students are engaging. so this is something I know at that level we haven't really thought through as well as we need to. And I don't know how you find that balance, but of course, at the same time, I mean, I'm a firm believer that, as Rachel was pointing out a minute ago, I think, you know, involving parents in the process is part of the deal. Like it's the holistic practice of peace education needs to be involving not just the student, but the school community, the parents, the families as well. In this moment of COVID, I'm not quite sure yet if I have the answers for how we do that effectively.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. Any more questions, Amanda?
I have two very interesting questions in the chat here. Hinata and Ben asked quite a similar question. It is, I feel the definition of peace education differs from one country to another. And in some countries, for example, in Taiwan, they don't even have the concept of peace education. So how should we promote the peace education in those countries? And Ben then asks quite a similar question, saying that in Cameroon, peace education is still to become a reality. So what can teachers who are not trained and don't have textbooks on peace education do to implement it in Cameroon?
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. Who would like to start? Because I think this will be the last question, and then we'll have a final comment from each of you about the ultimate vision. So who would like to start with peace education in different countries, different societies? What do you do when it doesn't exist? Jen, you look...
Well, so I put in the chat there, because we have limited time, a link to booklets that were developed by UNESCO. There's 7 short little booklets that'll help, because what those questions are asking are covered in entire courses. There's so much there, but there's some good practice tips from around the world with links to the good practice research, both for teacher training, for textbook development, for curriculum. And so you can click on that link. But to the answer about, you know, how you define peace and conflict resolution education. So in each of our countries, we've found that there are different terms that are acceptable, and Tony can probably definitely talk about this too from the Global Campaign for Peace Education perspective. But so what does peace education look like? Some of our countries, like in Central and South America and the Caribbean, are focused on what's called democracy education, and that includes a lot of the key concepts, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we might say in some parts of the world would be conflict resolution education or covered in peace ed. In other parts of the world, we're calling it learning to live together, which is one of the UN terms. And sometimes the UN also uses the term social cohesion. One of the most popular terms that's being used right now around the world is social emotional learning. That's been an acceptable term, which includes those knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so I think one of the things is looking at many of our countries too, where they don't use the term peace or conflict resolution, are incorporating these core skills into, if they have multicultural education, is one of the places that it's being included, like in Kyrgyzstan. So I'm going to hand it over to some other folks, and I'll put a couple more links in for folks who'd like to read more. Thanks.
Thank you. That's really important, actually, to expand the understanding. I think, yeah, it's too easy for people to say, oh, no peace here, we can't talk about peace education, and to have this broader understanding. Thank you. Who else would like to speak to this?
I can
oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ken.
Sorry.
Go for it.
I'll address it briefly. I mean, I think
Okay.
Jen is right. I mean, the only places that we really see in the world where we have curriculum and peace education are typically in contexts that are emerging from violent conflict. So there is, you know, in our generalized understanding of what peace is and what violence is, these are the spaces in which we see peace education curriculum emerging. But the reality is peace education takes, as Jen points out, takes many different forms that are born out of conditions of violence, be they direct violence or various forms of structural violence, like we're unpacking here in the class, or in this conversation today, or transitions that a country is experiencing. So, in the United States, we don't have peace education. It's really, very rarely is that something that we talk about. We have social emotional learning in schools. We have anti-racist education, restorative justice practices. So these are addressing very specific manifestations of violence. So that's not, that's one way of looking at it. We're working on a project right now that could be pretty useful to address this challenge. It's not quite open and ready to share with the public yet, but the Global Campaign is doing a kind of a global research project that we're calling Mapping Peace Education. And so our intention is what I've just sort of described here, is to map out the various approaches and responses to peace education rooted in very specific social, political, cultural, economic, and historical contexts, and analyzing the efforts to peace education efforts in those situations, providing a space so you can compare different contexts. So if someone is coming from a country that might be an emerging democracy, for example, they could look at another country in a similar context, kind of learn some lessons from them. But this project will be a huge online resource that we're going to be sharing to the general public, really great for researchers, policymakers, teachers, and others who are looking for ways in which they can learn from similar contexts to develop peace education. Maybe the last piece I would share would be this, is that I find that meaningful change in education really comes from the top down. So even in places where we see peace education policy within national government at the national kind of level, the implementation gap is pretty wide. And I find that the most meaningful changes come from sustained pressure that comes from the grassroots. When citizens and teachers and educators and students come together and challenge the normative agenda of curricula and put forward the visions that they think are important. So I think we can't look past the non-formal work of peace education. It's what puts the social and political and cultural pressure on the school curriculum to change. And without that, we don't really see that ever really happening in a sustained way.
Thank you very much. That's all really important, and echoing to some extent what Rachel had said earlier. Rachel, you had a point. I think you wanted to.
I'll keep it super brief. I know we're running out of time. Just to build on what.
If you have 5 minutes just to finish and to wrap up. Sure.
Just to build on what Tony was saying, I think that there is a role for civil society educators to put this grassroots pressure, but I would also say civil society often ends up filling that gap between the aspirations we have for education and what the formal system can offer. As we know, so much of young people's time is spent outside of the classroom. And so I think that there is a huge potential, and you will probably find in any country where you're looking, any locality where you're looking, there are already civil society organizations who are working on this under whatever name or label they're using for it. In Cameroon, I know, for example, there's an organization called Local Youth Corner Cameroon that does peace education in a variety of forms. And I would say another place to look would be youth-led organizations and movements. Peace education is one of their primary, they see as this primary hope for the future. And so many youth-led organizations and movements focus on peace education. And I think when it comes down to what we really need for peace education, some of the basic building blocks are not, they don't require a specialized degree to offer them, to transmit them to other people. And I'm happy to also share a link for youth-led peace training produced by a youth-led network, which is available to anyone. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Also really, really useful. Thank you. Charlotte, Thank you, Rachel. Very, very useful. Charlotte, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for this wonderful dialogue, and it's certainly good food for thought. And I think, you know, if we think of a vision in the future that really centers around education and the importance of education in general, and kind of when you look at that from an inclusive element, that automatically is promoting peace education. And so I think it was really interesting to hear everybody's thoughts, and I hope we can continue a dialogue in different ways. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually going to ask each person for a sentence or two, like you've just given, about a vision and about, I think you put it, what education is and can be. I think you said yours, but thank you very much. Rachel? Just a sentence or two on
Sure.
vision.
Yeah, I think maybe to summarize very briefly, I would say if we start thinking beyond peace education towards education for peace, there are so many parts of that that we could work on and break down into very manageable pieces that will add up to this bigger vision where education will support this inclusive society that we want to see.
Thank you very much. Tony?
Yeah, I think just going big picture again, like where I started talking about the big kind of purposes of education. I think if we're going to rethink education in a post-COVID-19 world, we're not even post-COVID-19 yet, obviously, that we think that the fundamental purposes should be about the achievement of our full human potential. And so to me, that embraces all these aspects of a culture of peace that are so important. Being able to develop the skills to be in right relationship with ourselves, with other persons, you know, with other cultures, and the broader ecosystems that we're all a part of, right? So I think that that's one of the things that we need to do. We need to challenge that and go beyond the purposes of education as simple preparation for participation in economic systems and political systems. Those things are important too, but we have to embrace the full development of our human potential. You can't do that without peace being at the core.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you. And Jen?
Thank you so much. So I feel as if COVID has taken us 20 steps back in education in some ways, and yet I think it's an opportunity to, when we get settled, to actually advance us into the future to do what we do even better, using a multitude of technologies so that we can further engage, as Rachel was mentioning, the young people in the learning process, so that we can move forward with less of the, or a greater focus on applying the skills in practice using a wide variety of technology to make positive change in our communities through peace and conflict education. Thank you.
Thank you all for really an inspirational conversation. And you've left us with doing what we do even better, with fulfilling our human potential, with common humanity, with inclusion, with so much to think about. And as Charlotte said, I hope we can continue this conversation. I think there's lots and lots to think about and plenty to build on. And I hope that we can, all of us, start to do something towards education for peace, as it's so nicely put. Thank you all very much indeed for being such a brilliant panel. Great pleasure to listen to you all. Thank you so much. Bye all. Thank you. Thank you, participants, for sharing, for questions.